Hello, everybody. I welcome you to our IMI Prefer webinar about designing, conducting, and applying results from patient preference studies, the Prefer framework. My name is Conny Berlin. I'm the industry lead of the IMI Prefer project, and I'm happy to introduce this webinar to you, and I will now share my screen. So let's get started. First, thanks very much for your interest in this webinar, for attending it. We have a high number of registrations and we are really happy about your interest. So let me introduce the topic of today. Over the recent years, the patient perspective became a really important element in drug development. However, there is a lack of guidance how to capture the patient voice. What is important to note is that patient preferences, which are our today's topic, are one component to capture patient's voice in medical product decision making. And also here, we face a lack of experience and uncertainty about how to conduct patient preference studies and how to apply the results. When we started the Prefer project, we had a lot of open questions. So examples are, can patients do these preference studies? Which patients? Do we have cognitive requirements? What methods should we apply in patient preference studies? How valid are the results? And as you can see, many, many more questions. So these questions shaped the Prefer project goals, which are to establish recommendations to support development of guidelines for industry, regulatory authorities, for health technology assessment bodies and payers on how and when to include patient preferences to inform medical product decision making. One other goal of this Prefer project is a qualification opinion, which we seek from the European regulators, EMA, and from the HTA bodies, UNETA. This qualification is about the Prefer framework, endpoints to consider for method selection, along with 5 methods for performing patient preference studies to inform regulatory and HTA body medical product decision making. We expect that the public consultation for this qualification opinion starts in the next few weeks, and we would like to use that opportunity to share with you that this would be one option for you and the only option to show continuous interest in this topic, to read actually the qualification documents and to submit your feedback. We have all your email addresses from the registration, and so we will contact you once we know that the public consultation starts to inform you about this period. Now, why do we have developed a Prefer framework? In general, frameworks provide a common understanding of how to approach a complex problem. Those of you who are familiar with drug development know that over the last 20 years, benefit risk frameworks have been developed, such as, for example, the BRED framework. And these frameworks have helped to support the submission dossiers and the presentation of benefit risk in a structured way. Now, you have seen from the many open questions we had at the beginning of the project that also Prefer faces a complex problem. So that's the reason why IMI Prefer has developed a framework for patient preference studies. And this Prefer framework aims to inform patient preference study teams on the design of those studies, on the considerations when to conduct preference studies, but also to guide decision makers when using preference study results. The Prefer framework for patient preference studies has 3 major framework components, and you will learn about these framework components today. So Kristin Bullok from Lilly will show you the overview of all the framework of the both framework components 1 and 2. Hauber from Pfizer will show you the points to consider for method selection. Bennett Levitin from Janssen will talk about the application of preference data to regulatory decisions. And Irina Klimwood from the Belgium Health Care Knowledge Center, KCE, will talk about the application of preference data to HTA decisions. We will spend between 10 and 20 minutes for each of these topics. And then we have at the end about 20 minutes for questions and answers. So I would like to ask you to submit your questions in writing already during the webinar in the chat tool so that we can address these questions later. But you still have the option to raise your hand and your voice during the Q&A session. If you have questions after the webinar, then please feel free to contact the Prefer Consortium via contact@imi-prefer.eu. And we also would like to share with you that there is a series of Prefer webinars. Those which happened already are recorded and you find them on YouTube. You see the link here. These recordings contain all the presentations, but not the Q&A sessions. And you also can see on our Prefer webpage what other webinars will come in the future. So please just watch our calendar and get registered for further webinars. With this, I'm happy to hand over to our first speaker, who is Kristin Bullok.
Thank you, Connie. As noted, I am Kristin Bullok, a benefit risk scientist at Eli Lilly and Company. I am also privileged to be included in the Prefer project, both on the communications team and as a recommendation development team member. My aim today is to provide a basic guide as to the why behind the framework developed by Prefer and to help familiarize you with the content. So starting with the why. There are many ways to collect patient views, and the use of these preferences are becoming increasingly important, which I will go into on the next slide. But broadly speaking, these terms around patient views are coalescing into three buckets, which I show here. First, the patient input or patient experience. This can include involvement in patient panels and representation at advisory committees. The patient perspective, as a subset of patient experience data, can be collected and used to develop core outcome sets and patient-reported outcomes. A smaller related subset to patient perspective are patient preferences. And the definition of these I will go into on the next slide, but what we're interested in here is how we can collect and use these patient preferences. So what I wanted to do here is distinguish patient preferences from patient-reported outcomes, which are a well-known output, particularly in clinical trials. With respect to preferences, on the left-hand side, they are qualitative or quantitative statements on the relative desirability or acceptability of attributes among health interventions. So essentially, this is the treatment profile of a drug or medical device. For example, an easy way to think about this is when you look at treatment A and the side effect profile and the benefits, which do you prefer when you compare that with treatment B? Whereas for patient-reported outcomes on the right-hand side of the slide are based on the status of a patient's health condition. And the patient reports on this without any interpretation from someone else. So essentially, it's a question of how did the treatment or intervention that you took make you feel. Collecting patient preferences is becoming increasingly important for medical product decision-making across the life cycle of a drug. One way that patient preferences can be used is to better understand patient-relevant endpoints and to understand the acceptability of a particular benefit-risk trade-off. However, when it comes to using patient preferences as substantial evidence for decision-making, for example, from a regulatory perspective, there's limited experience. But this gap provides an opportunity to create a framework. As Connie noted before, frameworks have been used in the past, and the advantages of a framework are to, for example, drive consistency of use for that certain subject, or it can provide a common understanding of how researchers can approach the problem. So therefore, I prefer, created the framework that I'm about to go into detail for you. As you saw from Connie, this is the high-level overview of the Prefer framework. It's comprised of 3 components, which in and of themselves also have subsets. Today, however, I will focus only on component 1 and component 2, as our other speakers will talk about in more detail component 3. So first, what is the purpose of this Prefer framework for patient preference studies? It is simply to inform study teams on what they should consider when they're designing and conducting studies, but it also helps guide decision makers when they use the preference results to inform their decision making. It is important, however, that preferences and the design of preference studies are not conducted in a vacuum. So we don't need a preference study for everything. What we focus on in the Prefer framework is the use of preference studies when there is a preference-sensitive situation or decision to be made. And I'll go into the definition of this in a couple slides. It is also important to create, design, and conduct these studies in collaboration with the relevant stakeholders, especially those who are making the decision. So those that I've noted here are patients, and we have included them in the Prefer project as research partners, not just as participants who are involved in the study. And also regulators and HTA bodies and payers are important to consider when designing and developing the study. For the Prefer framework component 1, going more into detail, the study purpose is comprised of 3 points, which I'll go into on the next slide. And then the study objective takes these points and helps inform, helps the study team describe how the study will inform the decision that is to be made. So first, when we think about the anatomy of a study purpose, the decision makers can be an HTA body, a regulatory agency, or it can be a patient advocacy group who wants to better understand the preferences of their members. Of course, it can also be industry and how they want to move the medical product along the life cycle. But again, as I noted before, the Prefer framework focuses on studies that are conducted to inform a preference-sensitive decision. And this is when we need to understand patients' views on the most important outcomes for a disease treatment because they are unclear. And then it could also be that there is no treatment option available that is clearly superior to another. And we would like to get the perspective of the patient who actually will be taking the medical intervention on which ones they would prefer. Tolerance for uncertainty on treatment effects can also be unclear, and this can be another preference-sensitive situation. So finally, wrapping up study purpose, it's very important to clearly define whose preferences you are collecting. So that includes the disease and or why the treatment is going to be given, and then of course the various characteristics. Then now moving on to component 2, organization. Briefly, as indicated on this slide, you want to conduct studies with people who are intimately involved in the disease state or have knowledge of it and the associated treatments, as well as study team members who are well-versed in preference methodology. Depending on the study purpose, you may also want to include the regulatory and or HTA body that will be informed about the preference study, and as well as a statistician or someone who, of course, can analyze the data and help you best interpret it. With respect to study timing, there's just a few tips that the Prefer framework provides, but essentially it's basically thinking with the end in mind. So if you need a study to inform a decision of whether you're going to move forward with a drug, you need to make sure that you have adequate time to conduct that study and have the results available by the time the decision needs to be made. So of course you need to think through how long will this study take, how long will it take to recruit the participants, etc. Then now moving into a large aspect of component 2, which is design. As all studies that use human subjects, of course, we need to solicit informed consent before we can move forward with this study, as well as we want these study materials to be reviewed by ethics committees. The sample definition essentially describes the characteristics of those that you are going to recruit into your study. You can think of these as inclusion-exclusion criteria for a clinical trial. But the framework describes how we can set this up, and your sample definition needs to align with your study purpose and also consider representativeness. So how applicable will the results be to the target broader patient population? And then if appropriate, depending on the age of the sample or the participants that you're including and or the cognitive abilities, you may want to include caregivers. So briefly touching on methods, as Brett will go a little bit more in detail on this. High level, fit the study purpose. And then the method also needs to take into account how large the study will be. Really, this comes into consideration when you're looking at rare diseases. So a rare disease, of course, will mean that there are fewer participants you can recruit. It will take longer. But also you may not be able to have as large of a sample size, and some methods may require larger sample sizes than others. With respect to preference question design, which is essentially the meat of your entire study, this involves developing your instrument or the discussion guide that you will be using to collect the actual preferences from your participants. And when we say preference question, it is not just the questions. There are many parts including the ones that I list here with respect to context for the study, actual questions, and then before you start and conduct the study, you need to make sure that all the materials that you will put in front of your participants are understood in the intended manner. Finally, it's very important to consider what will be the study burden. You know, what is the length of the study, how much mental effort is needed for the participants to put in their preferences. So going a little bit more in detail on the main elements of preference question design, of context, alternatives, and assessing. I briefly went into context already, but basically it is describing why the participant is participating and what will be asked of them. So example, it explains a situation that the participant needs to think about when they're answering the question. This kind of example, it could be assume that there is a hypothetical treatment to slow your cognitive decline, which we need you to understand the different treatment options that could be available and compare them. So that is an example of what the situation could be that you would present in front of your participants in your question design. Alternatives essentially describes the different aspects of the treatment that you're going to be asking the participants about. But it's really critical that what you include in there are meaningful to the participants. So, for example, for patient preference study, if you are not understanding previous preferences of patients, you may need to do a pre-study or qualitative study to initially get these attributes or characteristics into your preference design. Alternatively, you can comb the literature and understand treatment preferences as well as standard of care that's out there. For assessing, this again means that you want to make sure whatever materials you put in front of the participant, particularly the questions and the context, are understood in the intended manner. And then, of course, you need to revise your study materials to make sure that they reflect the learnings from that assessment. Finally, the last part of component 2 of conduct. Again, I am going to be focusing only on the main elements of study conduct here, which are, of course, recruiting and collecting the data. So this requires a screening of your participants. similar to a clinical trial. You need to make sure that the participants that are included meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria, for example, and that the data are stored in the appropriate manner, particularly with respect to rules and regulations of the country in which the study is conducted or will be used to inform a decision. Once the data are collected, the next step is, of course, analyzing and interpreting your data. But what's important here that the Prefer framework points out is we need to have pre-planned, pre-specified analyses to minimize bias, for example. And then it is acknowledged that there will be more than likely post hoc analyses once the data arrive and are first analyzed using pre-planned analyses. So what you should do in your design part is make sure that you have an approach specified for how you will handle these needs as they arise with respect to post hoc analyses. Finally, it is important for transparency to write up your study results, not just for your decision maker, but also for the participants who have provided the data for you. So then finally, briefly touching on component 3 with respect to how, so now you have your data, how are you going to use that data to inform your decision making? So Bennett will go into this in detail, but briefly, component 3 is made up of 3 elements. The common ways preference data can be applied or used, the technical methods behind your preference data application, and then also some suggestions for how preference data that has been used to inform regulatory or HTA decision-making, how that can be made public. So in closing, the foundation for the Prefer framework on preference studies is the belief that patients' views should be considered in medical product development, and that well-designed and conducted preference studies are one way to include these patient views. And the Prefer framework, as I noted before, is intended to help increase the appropriate use of patient preference studies across the medical product lifecycle. Thank you very much for your attention, and I now hope that you have a basic understanding of the Prefer framework. All of this information will be provided in more detail in the Prefer qualification briefing book once the public consultation has opened. So if you have any questions, please continue to insert them into the chat, and we will answer them at the end of this webinar. And now I ask Brett Hauber to provide you more information on the points to consider when selecting a method. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin. I'm Brett Hauber from Pfizer Worldwide Research Development and Medical. And I'm going to talk about points to consider for method selection. So choosing the correct method in any situation isn't always easy because there are many factors that go into that decision. Throughout the Prefer project, the issue of guidance on which method to choose has come up a number of times from both project members, external advisors, and stakeholders. However, the reality is that providing specific guidance in the form of a decision algorithm is not realistic because designing and implementing a patient preference study does not allow for a cookbook process. Therefore, we recommend that researchers first identify which methods are capable of providing the information necessary to answer the underlying research question based on methodological considerations, and then to assess which of those methods is most appropriate given the characteristics of the patients and the feasibility of conducting the study given current resources. So with that in mind, we organize the points to consider for method selection into 3 categories: methodological factors, participant factors, and feasibility factors. Methodological factors are those describing the specific requirements and capabilities of the preference elicitation method itself. These factors specifically address the ability of the method to answer the research question. Patient or participant factors describe the interaction of the patient population in 2 ways. First, the ability of the individual patients to complete the task, which often has to do with the cognitive capability of the patient and the complexity of the preference elicitation task. And second, the ability of the patient population to provide the necessary information, which most often involves the size of, diversity of, and access to the patient population. And finally, feasibility factors relate to the expertise and resources of the study sponsor or the study team. And it is important to note that the methodological factors can also influence the suitability of a method for different types of participants and the feasibility of implementing the method given the resource constraints of the study sponsor. First, let's look at the participant and feasibility factors. As noted above, participant factors deal with both the ability of the patient to complete the exercise and the ability of the sample, primarily with regard to sample size, to provide enough information to implement the method. When it comes to feasibility, the primary question relates to the expertise needed to implement a method or the ability to access such expertise. It is also important to note that feasibility may be impacted by time and budget constraints. So earlier, I alluded to the fact that there is a hierarchy among the three categories of factors to consider. Researchers should first identify which methods are capable of providing the information necessary to answer the research question based on the methodological considerations. Then patient and feasibility factors come into play and can help identify which among the possible methods is most appropriate in a specific situation. So for the remainder of this presentation, I will focus on how the methodological factors can be applied to 5 commonly used methods that were included in the EMA qualification briefing book. These methods are the discrete choice experiment, including best-worst scaling case 3, best-worst scaling case 1, best-worst scaling case 2, threshold technique, and swing weighting. We evaluated the 5 methods against 8 methodological points to consider. First, some methods are designed primarily to provide sample level estimates, while others start with the individual level estimates and aggregate up to get sample level estimates. Second, we want to know, does the method allow us to control for or test for preference heterogeneity and to identify its sources? The third point relates to the minimum required sample size. Fourth, of all of the 5 methods under consideration, we know that they can estimate preferences for individual attributes, but they differ in the number of attributes that they can address. Fifth, some methods focus on preferences for attributes or a single range for each attribute, while others focus on the preferences for changes in attributes across multiple levels. Sixth, some methods primarily estimate relative importance and trade-offs can be inferred based on relative importance. And some methods do this the other way around. They first estimate the trade-offs among attributes and then use that information to calculate the relative importance of the attributes. Seventh, some methods like the DCE directly elicit trade-offs among multiple attributes simultaneously. And that's one of the big advantages of a discrete choice experiment. However, methods such as the threshold technique estimate trade-offs among pairs of attributes. And finally, some methods can account for interaction effects among attributes, while others cannot. So we evaluated each of the 5 methods along those 8 points to consider. And we can see here that DCEs primarily provide sample level estimates, although some of the estimations allow you to infer or recover individual level estimates from the sample level estimates. So here we have sample, and then we have here the both for the ones that allow us to start with the individual level estimates and then aggregate up. So in this case, the threshold technique estimates a single number or interval for each pairwise trade-off for each individual, and then the sample means are a function of the individual level estimates. For best-worst scaling 1 and 2, simple methods can be used to recover individual level estimates, or the data can be analyzed at the sample level. And for swing weighting, each respondent provides a unique set of weights, which can then be aggregated to calculate weights for the sample as a whole. All 5 methods can be used to address preference heterogeneity, but they differ in the ways in which it is addressed. Sample size is a difficult subject because the required sample size depends on more than just the method. So the assessment for each method is somewhat vague. In general, however, DCEs require the largest sample sizes, and swing weighting probably requires the smallest sample size. And as previously noted, all methods can elicit preferences for individual attributes, but the number of attributes that each can accommodate varies. In general, discrete choice experiments and best worst scaling case 2, because they are profile-based methods, tend to be more limited in the number of attributes that they can accommodate. But you can see here, this is somewhat vague because we don't have hard and fast rules on the numbers of attributes that can be accommodated by any method. When we look at the remaining 4 points to consider, in general, best worst scaling case 1, threshold, and swing weighting estimate preferences for each attribute or a single change in the levels of each attribute. In contrast, discrete choice experiments and best worst scaling case 2, again, because they are profile methods, almost always elicit preferences for more than 2 levels of each attribute. DCE and threshold technique tend to estimate the rates of trade-off first and then use that information to calculate relative importance, whereas swing weighting and best worst scaling 1 tend to do it the other way around. However, DCE can be used to estimate multiple trade-offs simultaneously, and the threshold technique tends to estimate 1 trade-off at a time. Best worst scaling 2 is a unique case because it considers multiple attributes in a profile, like a discrete choice experiment, but it considers only 1 profile at a time, unlike a discrete choice experiment. So on the one hand, it appears to provide estimates of relative importance rather than trade-offs, like the best worst scaling case 1, but it does so more it does allow for multiple levels or a set of attributes simultaneously, like a DCE. So this one is a little unique. And finally, because they consider simultaneous trade-offs among a set of attributes, discrete choice experiments and best worst scaling 2 can easily account for interaction effects, while the other methods cannot. So, if there's only one thing that people take from this presentation, I would like it to be that even with a small set of methods, and these are just the 5 common methods that are described in the EMA qualification briefing book, the performance of each method on the methodological factors is not entirely unambiguous. While we can provide some general ideas, the performance of a specific method on methodological grounds alone needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis. So with that in mind, it is important to understand that there are multiple patient preference methods available. And when choosing a method, the first task should be to determine which method or methods can address your research question. Sometimes this exercise leads you to a single method, but most often there are multiple methods that could provide the information that you need. In all cases, once you've identified the potential methods, you should consider participant and feasibility factors. However, throughout the process, the choice of method should always be guided on what will provide the right level of evidence for the decision maker. So with that, I will turn it over to our next section. Which I believe is Bennett.
Hello, this is Levitan. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I will share my screen. And Carl, there's something wrong with my screen. Please switch to your video. We'll watch from that one.
Okay.
Thank you. So I'm Bennett Levitan. I'm a senior director at Janssen R&D, and I'll be discussing the third component of the framework on the application of preference data to inform regulatory decisions. So we go to the next slide. There are lots of ways you can use preference data to support a decision. Sometimes it's kind of straightforward, but it often gets messy because there's so many things you could do. So component 3 of the framework gives you some structure for applying preference data to decisions. Next slide. So the way we think about it is there are sort of three broad classes of techniques by which you can apply preference information to support a decision. You could use the preference information alone. You could use the preference information and clinical data viewed jointly, or you could take the preference and clinical data and mathematically combine it into what's often called quantitative benefit risk assessment. And one example of each might be the relative importance of the attributes, which you get from the preference survey alone. The second is the graphical techniques, where you might look at preference and clinical data together. And the third might be a choice share. So next slide, we'll look at the preferences alone. So here's one example. I'm going to show you a series of examples because they make it easy to follow how they could be used. So consider the disease Fragile X syndrome. It's a rare genetic condition. You've got learning and intellectual disabilities and cognitive impairment, and there's really no cure. So a company did a preference study during phase 2, because in this rare disease, people had no idea what the real endpoint should be, and they wanted to prepare for what endpoint should be used in phase 3. Next slide. So there are 6 attributes, like learning and applying new skills and explaining needs. These are explained more obviously in the survey. Now animate, and when the people conducted the survey, next slide, Carl, there were 2 attributes that were considered most, Carl, go back, please, that were considered most important. Prior slide, please, Carl. The first and the fourth are the ones that the clinical and commercial people thought were the most important. Now, the size of the purple lines shows the relative importance of the attributes. And you could see the fourth one is actually the least important. So the clinical and commercial perspective actually got it totally wrong. The caretakers, and the preference study was done on the caretakers or parents because the children couldn't do the survey, actually regarded controlling your own behavior and caring for your own self as the most important attributes. So it shows you that you can use a quantitative preference survey and get radically surprised by what people think is the most important thing that you should study or what your drug should do. Now, as it happened, this drug failed in phase 2. Had it not, the company would have used this information to design the particular endpoints that they would use in phase 3. So I think it's a fascinating example of how off our instinct can be. Next slide. So that was relative importance. Now, a very common tool that's used, or metric that's assessed from preference studies when you're using the preference study by itself is maximum acceptable risk, or MAR. This is an old example, but I always like it because of how surprising it can be. So this is in Alzheimer's, and people were asking if I convert 1 year of moderate symptoms to mild symptoms, or 5 years of mild symptoms to moderate symptoms, to lesser symptoms, how much risk of death or severe disability due to stroke would you be willing to accept? So people are terrified of Alzheimer's, so these lines are pretty high, these bars. So if I were to take 1 year of moderate symptoms and make them only mild, people would take up to a 5% chance of death or permanent severe disability due to a stroke. Now, if you essentially halt the disease, which is a 7-year time frame in the study, and keep your symptoms at the mild level, people would take over a 30% chance of death or permanent disability. Now, that's insanely high. And what this is telling us is, 1, people are terrified of Alzheimer's, and 2, people would probably be willing to accept risks that are beyond anything that any company or health authority would be comfortable putting on the market. Then, when you do this type of information, it has very good roles for benefit risk, but it also has roles in assessing a target product profile. What are the ingredients for a successful product, or what are the thresholds that are acceptable? So that's another example of a way of using a preference study by itself to gain information for a decision. Next slide. So what if there's more than one risk? So that was a maximum acceptable risk for just one risk. Well, this is a technique that's becoming more popular. It's still very new, where you could look at multiple risks versus a given benefit. So here it's rather abstract. If I take people from severe to mild symptoms, I have risk 1, adverse event 1, and adverse event 2. Anything below the red line is acceptable. In other words, any combination of 2 risks that's below that line has benefits exceeding risk on average. The maximum acceptable risk for one of the adverse events by itself is on the axis, so a little over 8% for adverse event 1, a little over 5 for adverse event 2. Next slide. Now, if you don't know the degree of benefit, or there are multiple degrees of benefit, which is always the case, you can apply the same idea. But now, if you have a less valuable benefit, like only moderate to mild, you still have a viable product where benefits can still exceed risk as long as you're below the yellow line. Next slide. Now, we were just looking at the line, but that's sort of the average preferences. What if you want to take into account the population heterogeneity of preferences? So around each line is a distribution. And the red line is, say, the mean preference, but the blue line gives you the distribution of the maximum acceptable risk, where 90% of your sample would choose to accept the combination of risks. So this is a way you can begin to not just think about 2 adverse events or multiple adverse events versus a benefit at once, but also to what degree population heterogeneity interplays with your preference assessment. Next slide. Now, these are all linear trade-off curves. There's no reason they could be constrained that way. I was just doing it to be simplistic. But in the real world, models can be just like this and much more complex. And we're only depicting this in 2 dimensions, but there are tools that have been developed. In fact, the FDA used one for an obesity device approval back in 2015 that can do essentially the same thing as this curve. So that's another way you can use preference information alone to support decision making. The last one I'll show is starts on the next slide. So this is a mock example. It actually is from the obesity case study, but I'm just going to use it to build a story. Let's make believe we have a new efficacy endpoint, the time to an event. And I would like to know an effect size, that's meaningful and I could use to feed my statistical hypothesis test. But I have no idea. It's a new endpoint. But I do know an effect size that I trust, say, for heart attack. So I can use a preference study to connect these and come up with an effect size for the new endpoint. So next slide, or animate, Carl. So I start with a well-accepted effect size. I just made it up of 0.5 for heart attack. Animate. So now I ask, what is the preference change that's associated with that accepted effect size? That's the black double-headed arrow. Animate. I now move that over to the novel endpoint, and animate. I take that down to the x-axis, and I get the preferentially equivalent effect size. So in this mock example, a change of 2 years in this novel time to efficacy endpoint is preferentially equivalent to the well-accepted effect size of 0.5% for heart attack risk. Again, these are made-up numbers, but the point is, if people trust the effect size for the heart attack risk, I can use that same trust for a now 2-year effect size for this novel time to efficacy endpoint. Now, this is certainly not the only way to come up with effect sizes, but it's one way you could use preference studies to inform them. Next slide. So those were methods of using preferences alone to inform a decision. Now, when you start bringing in the clinical data, you can start looking at this information together. And typically, these are graphical techniques. So next slide. So here's a forest plot in an anticoagulant with mock data. So each row is a different endpoint. The 34.2, the minus 34.2 means if you have 10,000 patients treated for a year, there'd be 34.2 deaths due to any cause on the study drug versus the comparator. So anything on the left favors the study drug. The endpoints are in order of impact or preference, essentially. The most severe ones on top, the least severe ones on bottom. And you can see anything on the top and the middle either favor the study drug or on the 0 line. It's only the things on bottom that favor the comparator. And this is actually very similar to a slide that was used at an advisory committee meeting with the FDA, and you didn't have to take it any further. It was obvious that the study drug was helping where it was important and hurting where it was less important. Now, in this particular slide, for simplicity, the endpoints are listed in order of preference rank. Next slide, you can certainly take this a step further and displace them by their actual preferences. For example, you could see the large gap between disabling stroke and everything on bottom, which is pretty important to the benefit risk story. And this, in theory, is a good idea. In practice, it can get awkward because the endpoints will land on top of one another, and people will start questioning the data more than they would just rank. So it's fine, but you have to ask whether this is the additional complexity of this type of visualization is worth the benefit. And if this is too messy, next slide, you can go into tabular form. So this is essentially an effects table with the two studies, a rate difference, a graph of the rate difference, and a graph and numbers for the preference weight. And then you could mentally decide how to balance these using the rate differences and the weights, or use your judgment whether you trust the weights. It's a very useful summary. It basically is an augmented effects table. Now, when you look at this, it also makes you think, well, why can't we go the next step and combine that information, the rate difference information, and the preference weight information? And that brings us into the third class of methods. So next slide. So here we're talking about the quantitative benefit risk methods, where you mathematically combine preference and clinical data. And I'll just do two methods. There are a variety of techniques around, and they're growing in popularity, and they're beginning to become less academic and more used in the regulatory context. The first one, next slide, is called choice share. This actually was used in a regulatory decision by CDRH. You're asking what proportion of patients would use the treatment. So this was for a medical device. And in this case, it's will I choose to use the device or not? And there are various properties of the device listed in the boxes. And then on the right is the percentage of people who would choose to use it. So virtual device A, 5% of people would choose to use it versus not. The gastric band, 11.6% people would choose to use it or not. And so this is a technique whereby you can mix the clinical data to come up with this probability or choice share to get a sense of what it would be like for these people, this population, when confronted with the opportunity to use the treatment, how many people would choose to use it. And in fact, this particular concept, that choice share, really was one of the elements that supported that CDRH decision. And you could apply it to the population as a whole, or to subgroups with greater or lesser risk tolerance if you want to refine this. But the example I'll spend a little bit more time on is a different method. Next slide. So let me show you an example of a fake problem from an anticoagulant. So you're either preventing clots or you're causing bleeding, except in this case, you could see that the drug has caused, out of 10,000 patient years, 20 cardiovascular deaths, with a wide confidence interval that intersects 0. So it's not significant. But between that and the non-fatal, non-intracranial hemorrhage major bleeding, you wonder, is this a good drug? Well, you can also see it prevents 110 ischemic strokes that are not fatal. So there's the question. I cause non-significantly 20 deaths to any cause, but I prevent 110 non-fatal ischemic strokes. Am I helping more than I'm hurting? That's a hard question, at least not to, and hard to resolve without weights or preferences. So next slide. What I have here is an effects table. It's the two drugs, drug plus standard of care, placebo plus standard of care, and the risk difference, the same numbers that were plotted. Now, animate, Carl. I'm going to add the mean weight, which is sort of kind of correct, but they're just sort of mock for the example. And now I'm doing a simplified approach for multi-criteria decision analysis. The full model MCDA approach is more rigorous. It involves things called value functions, but I'm going to do something simple and just multiply the weights by the risk differences. So if you can animate, please. The contribution then is that risk difference times the mean weight. So 1 times 20.4, same. The minus 20.4 times 0.23 is a much smaller number. Now animate one more time, please. Now what you do is add the contributions, and you get the difference, in this case, in score, minus 15.9. Now that number actually has meaning. What this says is the difference between these treatments is the equivalent in the utility scale of 15.9 fewer deaths per 10,000 patient years. So that is what this think model is doing for you. It's converting 6 different endpoints, all with their own level of importance, to a standardized scale. And in this case, I picked death, so you could have used any type of scale. So the between treatment difference on average is 15.9, favoring the study drug. Okay, do I trust that? Well, next slide. MCDA is not meant to look at a single number and you're done. You dissect the results. You do sanity tests. You ask, do I trust it? So the first thing you might do is look at those contributions and ask, do they make sense? So you can see here that minus 15.9 is created of the sum of the blue bars. And the key drivers are obviously CV death and non-fatal ischemic stroke, which makes sense and is kind of intuitive from this example. But it also tells me that if I want to understand benefit risk, that's where I should focus. The other endpoints are nice to know, but they aren't the real key drivers. Next slide. So now I want to understand the effect of uncertainty. So I have uncertainty in my clinical data, and I have uncertainty in my weights. So I actually can do a Monte Carlo and account for every single uncertain parameter. And instead of having a single point estimate of minus 15.9, I now have the distribution of the difference in scores on the left. And now anything above 0 favors the placebo arm. So I could do the graph on the right, a cumulative density function, see where I hit 0, and that gives me the probability that benefits outweigh risks of about 65%. So this is very useful. Now I know, yeah, benefits outweigh risks on average, but it's certainly not a slam dunk. That 65% I can use to decide whether I'm comfortable, say if I'm a regulator, approving this, or if I'm a sponsor, sending this to health authorities. Now there's a lot more you can do with this. Next slide. This is just the beginning of the type of sensitivity analyses. So this is called a tipping point analysis. What I do here is I take each weight and I vary it over some range, here plus minus 2 standard deviations from the weight. Now, you could see all the bars on bottom don't get anywhere near the 0, which is the tipping point where you'd switch from favoring the study drug to the placebo. But the top one, the weight for non-fatal ischemic stroke, that bar goes all the way to the right. In fact, it goes all the way to 20, which is extremely favorable for the placebo. So this tells me that there is only one weight that is sufficiently uncertain to cause the model to reach the tipping point, but that it can cause the model to reach the tipping point. And this tells me if I want to reduce my uncertainty, if I want to take that 64.8 or whatever percent and move it higher, I want to focus on reducing the uncertainty of that weight. Or it tells me this is the limit to how much I can trust this particular model with the data I have. Now, there are many other ways to do sensitivity analyses on a multi-criteria model. And technically, this is actually called the stochastic multi-attribute acceptability analysis type model, but they're really the same, just with a different degree of math. But I wanted you to get a sense that you can take this MCDA type model very far, and you could use it to dissect the results and decide whether you trust them, or if I'm going to invest resources in reducing my uncertainty, where do I invest them? Next slide. So my takeaway message is there are numerous approaches that you can use to apply patient preference data to inform the decisions. And I went through the 3 classes of preference data on its own, preference and clinical data looked at in parallel, or preference and clinical data mathematically combined into quantitative benefit risk analyses. The general guidance is to use the simplest approach that addresses your research question, though I often use a combination of approaches. And we are seeing an increasing interest by health authorities for these mathematical approaches. In general, in the past, they were more the realm for academia. But I and others have anecdotal experience where health authorities are asking to see some of this work. The final point I'll make is as messy as some of them of what I might have shown you might look to some, the real-world application actually has another layer of complexity, where you have to do modeling for heterogeneity in your clinical data, heterogeneity in your preferences, dependency between your preferences, and dependencies between your clinical endpoints, nonlinearities in your preferences instead of that straight line or linear model, and many other issues. That all falls under the realm of mathematics, and it just tells you that you certainly can apply this work, but when it comes to real-world applications, sometimes you'll have to take it a step further. Anyways, thank you for the opportunity to share this thought on applying the preference data, the third part of the prefer framework. We'll now switch to Arena Cleanput. We'll talk about HTA considerations for benefit risk for the preference studies.
Thank you very much, Bennett. I will share my screen. So, my role today is to explain a little bit how Prefer sees the application of preference data to inform health technology assessment decision-making. Yes, my name is Irina Klimput. I work for the Belgian Healthcare Knowledge Center. I'm a senior health economist and scientific program director. This is the outline of my presentation. First, I will just recapitulate a little bit what has been said before. What can we learn from patient preference studies? This can be very brief, of course. But then why is it relevant for health technology assessment? How can patient preference data be used in health technology assessment? And shouldn't we use public preferences? This is, for those who are familiar with HTA, something that you frequently hear, of course, is that maybe it's not patient preferences we should look at, but rather public preferences. And then finally, I will discuss an unresolved issue about the application of patient preferences in economic evaluations in particular, and also suggest a solution to these unresolved issues. So what can we learn from patient preference studies? Just in summary, what we've heard before, patient preference studies can inform us about what matters to patients, how much it matters, and which trade-offs patients are prepared to make. So again, what is most important to patients? And before we dive into the precise question on how patient preferences can inform health technology assessment, I would like to highlight once again what the actual purpose of HTA is. And the actual objective of HTA is often, not always, you have specific cases of HTA, like for hospital decision-making, but very often the objective of HTA is to support reimbursement decision-making. And HTA tries to do this by making a full overview of all the relevant aspects related to health technology being a medical device or a pharmaceutical product. It can be any type of medical product or technology, even diagnostics or rehabilitation interventions. So HTA makes a critical assessment of the available clinical evidence on safety and effectiveness of these technologies, but also, and that's a very important part of HTA usually, by performing an economic evaluation. And this economic evaluation assesses the value for money of this health technology. So what is the added value, and is the added value worth the usually additional cost of this technology? A third large domain in HTA is the discussion on patient and social issues, and then finally also the legal, ethical, and organizational aspects related to the implementation and the use of new medical technology. So that's the context HTA has to work in. So it has to inform reimbursement decision-making, which makes it, of course, very subject to also the trade-offs that need to be made between the societal needs and the individual needs. So it's impossible for HTA to focus only on the individual patient needs, because there is a societal reality behind each decision about reimbursement, And that is that resources are limited and we just cannot reimburse or cover out of public resources everything that we would like to. So we have to make choices, we have to make trade-offs, and this is what HTA should take into account when making its assessments. To make this decision-making process a little bit more transparent and divide it in smaller pieces, smaller decisions, we developed in 2012 a framework for decision-making on reimbursement. And what I try to do on this slide is to highlight where patient preferences could come into the picture in each of these questions. So the first question would be, does this product target a therapeutic and societal need? Now, the therapeutic need is obviously something that is informed by the patient's needs and the patient preferences, so what matters most to patients. So obviously, when assessing therapeutic need, we need to know and we need to investigate what matters to patients and what matters most to patients. So just to know whether there are indeed needs that are unmet for patients and which can be met by a new medical intervention. When we are talking about societal needs, of course, we will rather look at societal preferences. The second question is about the willingness to pay from a societal point of view for a treatment that would improve the indication. So that's really a principal question about should this be paid for by the patient himself or should society pay for this? And this is also a matter that should be discussed from a societal point of view, and societal values and preferences would come into play. The next point is, are we as a society prepared to pay for this particular treatment? And this is a very important part of HTA. So the relative effectiveness of the new medical product or medical intervention will determine to a large part the willingness to pay for a treatment. So relative effectiveness assessment means that you will look at the effectiveness of the new intervention and compare this with the effectiveness of the existing intervention or the current standard treatment for this condition. And of course, what is important in this relative effectiveness assessment, and this is something that we argue within Prefer, is not only the purely clinical outcomes like survival or or disease-free survival, for instance. But what we should look at is whether this new treatment really improves the outcomes that matter most to patients. So that is why it is so important to first investigate the therapeutic needs of patients and to investigate what patients want to see improved when a new treatment comes. We want to take this into account in the relative effectiveness assessment by giving the right weights to the outcomes that matter and that matter most to patients. Are we prepared to pay more for this treatment than the best alternative? This is obviously something that we should not ask the patient, but this is a societal decision because it is eventually society that pays for this additional cost. And how much more are we willing to pay out of public resources is also a societal issue. So let's return now to the medical product life cycle. Where do we see the application of patient preferences with relevance to HTA when considering this medical product life cycle? When we start at the very early phases of medical product discovery and development, we argue that we want to understand patients' views on what matters, and in that case, we should identify them very early on. So even in the very early phases of the medical product life cycle, we should try to identify patients' unmet needs or patient needs to inform what kind of clinical and non-clinical outcomes should be included in the clinical trials that are set up later on in the context of a registration request and the eventual reimbursement request. We argue also that this should actually be product independent. You should go to the patient population with a specific indication that is targeted by the medical product, and you should ask these people, these patients, what are the things that matter to you? What do you want to see improved when a new treatment or a better treatment would become available for your specific condition? And this is important. So this is important for HTA because if you have done this right, then you can use this information in your relative effectiveness assessment, because you will return to these patient needs and you will weigh the outcomes of the new treatment according to what matters most to patients. So you will use this endpoint in the relative effectiveness assessment. There are, of course, other applications, and I will not go into these now because I think we will focus here in this presentation mainly on the HTA and reimbursement. Now, let's focus a little bit on this application in relative effectiveness assessment. So, as I said before, relative effectiveness assessment is one of the cornerstones of HTA. It's very important to do this in the right way. But there are different ways you can do this. And this is just one example. Suppose that you have a new treatment for a specific disease that is already, for which there is already a treatment available. So you have a standard of care, but patients suffer still from a lot of fatigue, from hair loss, nausea, and treatment burden with this existing treatment. So your patients highlight that these are the things that matter to them and that they want to see improved if they want to get a better treatment. So clearly, these are very disease-specific attributes for which you can use patient preferences in your relative effectiveness assessment. So whenever a new treatment comes up and asks for reimbursement, you can consider whether this treatment is as effective as the existing treatment in terms of hard clinical outcomes like overall survival, but at the same time also improves on these patient-specific, disease-specific and patient-relevant attributes like fatigue, hair loss, nausea, and treatment burden. But of course, this is a very indication-specific approach. And as I said before, HTA usually needs to take a broader societal perspective to inform reimbursement decision-making from societal point of view. So while the focus of a single health technology assessment is on one particular intervention for one particular indication, the scope of HTA is always larger. It has to work within this larger societal context. And there the question is, of course, the question the decision maker wants to know is, how can I allocate my resources efficiently in the healthcare system? This is something HTA has to take into account when making the assessments. So the question, and this is the unresolved issue I was referring to, is whether we should integrate patient preferences in cost effectiveness evaluations, in budget impact analysis, and in broader value frameworks. Because this is the second large cornerstone of HTA, that is that economic evaluation, the cost effectiveness analysis is its value for money. And when you look at Europe, you see that there are two different types of systems in place. One system is the one that looks at interventions within one indication. So this is, for instance, the case in Germany, where the incremental cost effectiveness ratios of different interventions for the same indication are compared. And then with a given budget for that indication, the resources are allocated to these interventions. So you choose the best, the most efficient health technology for treating that specific indication. But other countries like the UK, for instance, say, no, we don't have to look at one specific indication. We have to allocate our resources efficiently across the entire healthcare system. So we need to be able to compare the incremental cost effectiveness ratios for different indications, so across indications. And this has implications for the relative effectiveness assessment that you do in your health technology assessment. For instance, in this case, when you only look within indications and you allocate your resources within an indication, you can use disease-specific outcome parameters in your relative effectiveness assessment. Because these, as I said before, if you do a product-independent assessment of the patient needs within an indication, you can use these patient-relevant outcomes, disease-specific outcomes, in your relative effectiveness assessment. And you can then also use, of course, patient preferences for these different outcomes. If you want to make between indication assessments, that is not sufficient because you need to be able to compare the outcomes of different treatments for very diverse indications. So you need generic outcome measures, like for instance, the quality adjusted life year, where you look at life years gained and changes in health related quality of life measured by means of a generic outcome measure. So you have generic attributes, and because you need inter-indication comparability, you would not use patient preferences because they are not comparable between populations, but you would rather use public preferences. Another point I wanted to highlight is the importance of patient preference information for budget impact analysis. It has been explained by Bennett before, the preference study about the acceptability of benefit risk trade-offs of the new versus standard treatment can inform the decision maker about the possible uptake of a new treatment, the so-called choice share. Same applies for the preference study about the acceptability of uncertainty. So that will give you an indication of how many patients would be willing to take this new treatment instead of the existing standard of care. For instance, in the context of a managed entry agreement when there is still a lot of uncertainty, and this can inform your budget impact analysis. So in summary, I think I explained that patient preferences can be used in HTA on several occasions. For instance, when identifying the patient needs, which is information that you need for the relative effectiveness assessment. You can use it in budget impact analysis to identify the potential uptake of your new treatment compared to the standard of care. For cost effectiveness analysis, it depends on what type of system you are working in. It can be patient or public preferences. And the same applies to organizational aspects, where also it is patients and public preferences very often. For societal needs, you would look at public preferences, and for patient issues, of course, it's mostly patient preferences. And with that, I would like to hand over again to Conny, who will moderate the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.